like now then to go directly into our lecture, The Infinite Way, which we give in the Ascended Master's love and name. I would like to open it with a reading of Longfellow's Prometheus. It's called Prometheus, or the Poet's Forethought. Of Prometheus, how undaunted, on Olympus' shining bastions, his audacious foot he planted. Myths are told and songs are chanted, full of promptings and suggestions. Beautiful is the tradition of that flight through heavenly portals, the old classic superstition of the theft and the transmission of the fire of the immortals. First the deed of noble daring, born of heavenward aspiration, then the fire with mortal sharing, then the vulture, the despairing cry of pain on crags Caucasian. All is but a symbol painted of the poet, prophet, seer. Only those are crowned and sainted who with grief have been acquainted, making nations nobler, freer. In their feverish exaltations, in their triumph and their yearning, in their passionate pulsations, in their words among the nations, the Promethean fire is burning. Shall it then be unavailing, all this toil for human culture, through the cloud rack dark and trailing? Must they see above them sailing, o'er life's barren crags, the vulture? Such a fate as this was Dante's, by defeat and exile maddened. Thus were Milton and Cervantes, nature's priest and Corybantes, by affliction touched and saddened. But the glories so transcendent that around their memories cluster, and on all their steps attendant, make their darkened lives resplendent with such gleams of inward luster. All the melodies mysterious, through the dreary darkness chaunted, thoughts and attitudes imperious, voices soft and deep and serious, words that whispered, songs that haunted. All the soul in rapt suspension, all the quivering palpitating, chords of life in utmost tension, with the fervor of invention, with the rapture of creating. Ah, Prometheus, heaven scaling, in such hours of exaltation, even the faintest heart unquailing might behold the vulture sailing round the cloudy crags Caucasian. Though to all there is not given strength for such sublime endeavor, thus to scale the walls of heaven, and to leaven with fiery leaven all the hearts of men forever. Yet all bards, whose hearts unblighted honor and believe the presage, hold aloft their torches lighted, gleaming through the realms benighted, as they onward bear the message. Our subject today is the infinite way. We have no doubt known of the infinite way before we knew the finite way. We have no doubt partaken of immortality long before we partook of mortality. And this we hold as truth most dear, for we cannot possibly conceive that this that we are, with its knowing that I am I, has begun this year or last year, or even 100 years ago. For the wisdom that touches our being, the sound of the immortal consciousness echoing down the corridors of our whole life, speaks to us not of a short span, but of eternity. And so we consider that inasmuch as man is a created being, that we are creatures of God, that this God that is in us is our sole reality, and this outer transcendent being that is actually transcending himself, you see, is only an ephemeral thing that is becoming eternal. And so we recognize that the mortal is but immortality clothed upon with mortal garb. and enduring here in this so-called vale of tears, which may also be a place of tremendous joy, and expanding its light so that we will become one of the immortals. Now the ascended masters in this day and age have given us the most radiant picture of all that this means in the chart of the presence. The ascended masters in our time are the sanest voice that can be heard, because much of that which is heard in the name of theology and in the name of religion, even in the name of reason, is but the wild voice crying in the wilderness, not as John the Baptist did, declaring the way of the Christ, but crying in the human wilderness and repeating the vain babblings that mankind have come to accept as true because they are traditional. So we know that there is a distinct difference between the finite way and the infinite way. This is geometrized for us by God Himself. For a circle is a symbol of immortality, and a straight line is a symbol of mortality. But when we understand that a straight line has a beginning and an end, we also understand that a straight line is not truly straight at all, because it is a part of a circle. And so we come to realize that this existence, this mortal self, which Saint Germain in his Baconian and Shakespearean writings called a mortal coil, is itself a part of the infinite way. That then which we are, and which we assume ourselves to be, for we see in part and we know in part, is the finite, becoming the infinite. Hence, it too is a part of the infinite way. And we must recognize that in the great circle of life, this geometrical figure, the circle, there is contained all of the known universe. Without the circle, there is contained the unknown, because we could not know anything that would not be within the circle of man's knowing and being. We can only know that which is within ourselves. We cannot know that which is without ourselves. And we ourselves are not limited to the tiny circle that is our immediate aura. This is only a part of ourself. It is the finite self. And so we must recognize that man comprises a series of circles or emanations. And when we come to understand this in greater depth, we will know that the outer periphery is the center, and the center is the outer periphery. Now, at first, this seems to be a strange statement, and I do not intend to explain it because it is concerned with a certain revelation that has to come to each individual themselves, or they will not really appreciate it. And it is not our intention to bring out something for purposes of dispute and into the banality of human argument. However, for those open-minded individuals, and I feel that most all of you are, in fact, I choose to think that all of you are, I feel that the infinite God, in all of His great love, has placed us all within a great sphere. In other words, this entire universe is as though it were actually enfolded within a great sun. And everything that is happening in time and space is occurring within this sphere. The sphere is very vast. It may even have the power to expand itself or to contract itself. But I feel certain that there must be a place. There cannot be no place in existence. There must be some place. And therefore this place must be a great sphere, because most of the orbs. The planets and the starry systems are circular. The Earth itself has taken a circular shape. And I feel that this shell on the inside is very much like a mother's womb, and we will call it the womb of creation. If you have ever witnessed the birth of a child, you will appreciate that the child is enveloped in a very wonderful protective coat, as it were, which is delivered after the birth of the child into manifestation. This particularly wonderful envelope is an amazing thing in itself, because it has a series of veins and arteries that carry the blood all around it, and they come out as in rays like the sun, the most perfect thing that you have ever seen in your life. Just absolutely perfect and wonderful to behold. Now I feel certain that the finite side of life derives its nourishment from the infinite side of life, and that the nourishment comes through a series of rays that pour out and sustain the life action of all of the planets and systems of worlds, just as the blood in our veins flows through from the heart, so the actual radiance of the universe pours through the universe by these light rays. This, of course, is supported by our understanding of the mighty I Am Presence as we see it in the chart, because we notice the causal body is circular, but it is not flat. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't realize when they look at a chart. Man could not very well convey an orange on a chart or on a piece of paper without making it flat. So he has to create an illusion, as the artists in this room know, and there's quite a few of them, and I don't know how to describe it as they do, but they create some sort of an illusion on the flat paper that makes it look as if you could reach out and take the orange right off of the paper. Some of them look good enough to eat. But the same is true of the chart. There's a certain illusion created here, but it is not clear enough, and I don't think anyone can in our time create one clear enough that would actually show how that each of these color rings is a sphere. It's not a flat band. It's a complete sphere. You understand what I mean, don't you? Most of you get this picture. It's as though you had a marble, and then you put something around it completely, and then around that, you see. It's a series of spheres, and it's electronic pulsating light. Now, from the presence itself, the light rays come out through the causal body, not just on a flat surface. You know what I mean. But they come out in a complete omnidirectional action, you see, and penetrate through the whole substance. The same is true of the universe, except that apparently there is a sun connection in the center of the universe, and the rays pour in from the periphery to the center and then out again from the center to the periphery. And there seems to be a double action, negative and positive polarity, we'll call it, of the rays that are flowing forth and returning all the time. Now this, of course, what I am speaking of refers to the finite manifestation. But I'm convinced that it is an infinite manifestation in the sense that the power source of all is infinite in nature. Now, some of the great philosophers that are currently studying the nature of the universe have just recently come out with a new set of circumstances. They had previously told us that the suns and systems of worlds, after so many million years, would run down in their power, and that one day the people and children of this earth could look for the sun to go out and not sustain life here, and therefore would have a group of dead worlds whirling around a dying sun. Now they have shifted. First, they went into the concept of an expanding universe. They decided that the universe was like a child's balloon, and that it was continually, as if you put more air in the balloon, you'd keep expanding the size or the diameter of the balloon, you see, of the sphere. And that would make one star a little farther from another after a certain period of time. It would also alter the curvature of space within the sphere, you see. Now, of course, they've come out with this new concept, and they admit that there must be some means of refueling the stars, you see. And it's a rather interesting concept that they have come out with. And it shows, once again, that mankind, by human reason, when they go so far by human reason, they always come back to the infinite. They have tried to engineer God out of existence. They've tried to prove that God is just a happenstance, that a certain chemicals came forth, and as they bumped up against each other and exploded, that it created everything that has ever happened. But somehow or other they can never get away from this old answer about which came first, the chicken or the egg. They can't tell you where the chemicals came from or how they got here in the first place. So once again, we are face to face with the truth that no one can deny the existence of God and still be a rational being, although they may think they're rational. There is a definite quirk, as St. Germain says, in anyone's thinking where they try to deny the existence of God. Well, I don't believe there's anyone in this room that would deny the existence of God or in this entire building, because you wouldn't even come here. You'd think I was so foolish and silly if I was going to talk about God that you wouldn't even come to listen to me. And in fact, if I start talking about atheism and communism and all of these things, I wouldn't even want to listen to myself, because I think it's perfectly ridiculous. I feel the same way toward them that they probably do toward me. I really am not very tolerant of atheism, I'll have to truly tell you, because it seems to me to be such an unreasonable idea. The very nature of man's being in itself certainly shows that there is some great power behind it. Of course, to me it's never been an argument. I have never questioned the finite way as having any reality. I have always thought from the earliest childhood of the infinite way, and I have believed in the infinite way. And I'm sure most of you in this room have also felt this way, although there may be some who have at one time or another been a part of some atheistic movement. This is possible. I've met students of the light who were actually connected with atheism, and at one time they believed in it. But now today they're the staunchest students of the light because they recognized, that they were wrong. Now, one thing I want to point out that we feel in the organization of the Summit Lighthouse, we do not feel dogmatic about our concepts. We feel that God is, that He exists, we know that He exists, we believe in the Ascended Masters, we know that the Ascended Masters exist, there's no question in our mind about that, and we believe in the truth that they've released. We do not believe that every concept that every person has in the entire activity is necessarily absolutely accurate, because we have seen in our own world that sometimes we progress and are illumined on points that were not quite clear to us. In other words, something that happened a year ago, a spiritual address, we'll say, by one of the masters, for example, was made. And we thought that we understood it very clearly, and that we knew everything about this address. Then, as time passed, the masters communicated to us a little additional information, and studying to show ourselves approved unto God, not to man, through a new release, a point of information or two, the concept became broadened and enlarged. And so we revised our concept and improved upon it. Now, dogmatism, which tries to reduce everything to a creed that we can believe in, and calls together a council of so many human beings to sit down around a table and say, now we'll tell these people what we believe, because the world wants to know what we believe. Well, this is fine in one sense of the word. We could do this in a limited way, as we have with the pamphlet, A World Pillar. We've put some of our concepts and ideas that the masters have given us in there. But we have never told anyone, I don't think up until today, how we feel about the laws of God. We feel that the laws of God are purely perfect and complete and holy in every way in themselves. But we do not feel that mankind's concepts of these great laws are always necessarily absolutely accurate. We believe that we are not infallible. We do not for 1 minute think that we are infallible as human beings. We don't think that our staff in Washington is infallible. We're perfectly capable of making a mistake, the same as most everyone else is on the earth here. The only thing that we feel is infallible is God and the ascended masters. And we feel that their words are infallible in their own context. You understand what I mean by that? Within their own framework. We recognize that man can interpret or misinterpret anything. After all, wouldn't you say, dear hearts, that the universe itself is infallible? Wouldn't you say that the sun is infallible in the sense it's shining out there? We see it. And this is an undeniable truth. But we still do not know the complete nature of the sun, do we? Mankind have instruments, and they've studied the sun long before Copernicus existed. And they're still studying the sun. And yet they don't know all the answers. St. Germain, of course, is supposed to have said, I understand, it was reported to me from a previous activity, previous action, that someone said that the earth and the sun were 93 million miles approximately apart, and he said that it was less than 2 million miles apart because he had been there many times. Now, I do not know as to whether I have been accurately advised as to whether or not this was said. But to me, this is not vitally important, whether the sun is 6 million miles away or 100 million miles away. I don't expect in this body that I wear to necessarily journey to the sun, and I'm perfectly content to remain here on earth as long as God has work for me to do down here. If after I leave he wants to take me to the sun or any other place in the universe, I'll be happy to go. And if he wants to take me before I'm through with my work down here, I'll still be happy to go, I might add. But I'm not anxious to go out of any idle curiosity or anything like that. I feel that our work here is a very practical work, and I think this is one of the things that we must fix in our consciousness. That's why I spoke in a sort of a roundabout way to show you and illustrate a certain theory to you at the very beginning of this talk on the infinite way, because the rather nebulous statements I made on theory could be discussed for years. One could start discussing the pros and cons of theory. But theorizing is not what's important. What is important is practicality. In other words, the practical aspects of the Ascended Master Law. We already know that the universe comes from infinity. But we also know that you cannot take a finite man and woman with an earthly consciousness. And we're all part of that now in a way. We have an Ascended Master consciousness and we have an earthly consciousness. And we can't take this earthly consciousness and understand infinity. People think it's just a machine, and all of these little parts of the machine fit together and make a whole that complement one another. This is the finite concept. But we are interested in the infinite way, but we're interested in the infinite way as it relates to practicality from day to day. Now, there's one thing that we have to recognize. That any time that any of us become as wise as gods, and this was the statement that the sinister force made, said, eat of the fruit of this tree and you shall become as wise as gods. And you will be able to do anything, you see. You'll be as wise as God is. Has the Lord said you should not eat of the fruit of this tree? The only reason he said that is he doesn't want you to have the wisdom he has. So you just eat of it and you'll be just as wise as he is. Did he tell you you'd die? You won't die. That particular formula actually reveals the very thing I'm talking about. It deals with the interchange of the infinite powers of God and the finite individualization of the manifestation or man. In other words, try to relate this to the type of reason that everyone can absorb. Adam and Eve were, of course, I think you know the story, were embodied in this paradise of God, and everything was going very well. The Lord said you can have all the fruit you want to eat as long as you don't eat of this one fruit tree in the middle here, the garden of life. If you eat of that, the day thou eatest, thou shalt die. Now the enigma of that is, the meaning of that I will interpret for you in part. When you eat of the tree of life, that is, when you expand your knowledge beyond your domain of practical mastery, you die in a sense, you see, because the finite self cannot comprehend or master the infinite until it has expanded its attainment to the same degree as its wisdom. In other words, knowledge unused passes from the screen of the mind, and knowledge that is not appropriated is but an accretion of facts, which involves an investment of energy. And when God gives you energy through the power of holy wisdom, and then you don't use the energy to master the universe, this makes you accountable for the knowledge that you have. You have eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of life, and you do not use it. And you are charged with that. And in a sense you die then, not in a physical way, but you die to the realization of the infinite, because you are not able to realize the infinite. You can only realize a part of the infinite. And this is what St. Paul brought out in some of his own presentations on life. I was trying to grope there for the exact, precise scripture that I had in mind, and someone yawned in the audience, and I watched them yawn, and I said to myself, this must be terribly boring to them. And the minute I said that, I forgot the scripture, you see. So the moral of the story is, please don't yawn even if you feel like it. Otherwise, you're liable to make me get lost here in the trees of the Garden of Eden, and you'll be here all afternoon without ever finding your way into the infinite way. Anyway, we all know that a man has a consciousness, and that the consciousness that he has makes it possible for him to understand a certain sphere. You know what I mean. In other words, you can understand your body. That's about the first thing you understand as a baby. I think we should start with a baby. A baby understands his own body to a degree. It takes him a little while, as we've just recently learned with Sean. It takes him a little while to learn to use his hands, and longer to use his feet. He learns to use his mouth almost immediately. That's one part of man that has never been very well disciplined. But nevertheless, the baby takes a while to become adjusted to his environment. The baby at first, you see, is actually conscious in the womb. Now, a lot of people don't believe this, but this is absolutely true. These children are conscious in the womb, and they're adjusted to that environment, and they're in water. They're in water, and they're used to water. And then they come out into the air from the water elements, you see. It's a tremendous change for them, and that's why they sleep so much at first, is so they can get adjusted to the air element, and so that their organs inside, which were not used, the organs of digestion, can become accustomed to the type of food that mankind eats. Formerly, they were nourished directly through the blood vessels, connecting them through the umbilical cord to their mother. This is a very interesting thing, though, when you stop and consider how the child's environment is enlarged. And, of course, his first contact is with the parents and people who are peering in at him. You probably saw this picture in one of the modern nurseries where a baby was laying there, and it showed it from his crib. In other words, most of the time you're on the outside looking in. Well, this one was down in the crib, and it was a fellow that was illustrating something like Norman Rockwell, and he had all of the relatives standing there, all making faces at the child. And all of them were painted across the whole way. Some were grinning, and some were saying yoo-hoo and waving their hands, and it looked just like a zoo. And they were in a cage, you see. Well, it's all on what side you're looking at, you see. In other words, if you're on the side of the baby, that's one. If you're on the side of the person looking, that's another way. So it's the same way with infinity. When you have attained a certain state of consciousness, you can understand the lesser consciousness, but the lesser cannot necessarily understand yours. Now, some poet wrote some time ago, and he said, in referring to the ant kingdom. He said, the ruck of ant concern, meaning that people were not supposed to be too much concerned, of course, with the foolishness of just the ant world. Well, the ant world, if you ever studied it, is quite a very interesting world, in fact. They are marvelously well organized, and they tell me they even communicate with their antennas. They wiggle them a little bit, and you can find this out. If you start disturbing an ant sometimes, they'll wiggle their antennas, and I believe they must send a radio signal to somewhere else, because the first thing you know, a whole bunch of ants will come, you see, in answer to that call. Well, we don't have these antennas, but we seem to do a pretty good job of communicating in this world, especially if you've got something that you want to keep private. All you have to do is tell somebody, please don't tell anybody, and it's spread all over the earth. So, when we start thinking in terms of the tree of life in the midst of the garden of God, we have to understand that the fruit of the tree of life in the midst of the garden of God, that the garden of God is really ourself. This is the whole cosmos. This is everything. And the tree of life is in the midst of it. And if we try to probe all knowledge long before we have developed the capacities to work with that knowledge, we are not actually going to make the type of progress that we can make if we will be satisfied to go to the masters and to our presence and ask the presence to give us dominion over the finite world. First of all, master the set of circumstances that are closest to us. This is why the statement was made, he that can rule himself is wiser than he that can rule a city. If we cannot rule ourselves, our own thoughts and our feelings, how can we expect that we should want to reach out to the farthest planets or master them? And yet that is what mankind is doing today. Well, I'm not concerned, and I'm not crusading to stop space exploration. If the country wants to spend our tax dollar on exploring space, I have no objection to it. However, I'm talking now about a practical aspect of life. And this has to do with the measurement or not measurement of infinity. To me, the only way to square the circle, as St. Germain referred to the squaring of the circle, the only way to square the circle of infinity, which means to relate infinity in a practical way or box it in to your own consciousness so that you can use it, is to master the world right where you are, the finite world. If you have a sore toe, if you've got a corn, whether you call to the presence to get rid of the corn, or whether you go to a foot doctor, I don't think either one is so important. I wouldn't criticize someone that went to a foot doctor and got their corn taken care of, or if they went to the corner drugstore and got a corn plaster. It doesn't matter. If that corn is keeping you from enjoying life, that's keeping you from doing your decrees, it's keeping you from serving the masters, or it's causing you to have an unsweetened disposition so that you're not a pleasant person to live around, then I would get rid of the corn. And I think that corn is just as important as Copernicus or as Andromeda from your standpoint. And so the infinite must be related in order to live to the circle that we can comprehend. And we must master the sphere where we are, and then the Lord will say to us, and that's our God presence, will say to us, come up higher, thou hast been faithful in a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. I think one of the reasons why we have so much trouble in this world is because mankind is curious about many things, for they simply desire to know many things in order that they will be thought wise in some cases. In other cases, they just enjoy learning new things. Well, there's nothing wrong with this. I don't object to people learning new things if they don't get lost in the forest till the point they can't see the forest for the trees. In other words, I knew a woman that I'm going to tell you about. This woman lived in the Midwest part of the United States. And if I recall correctly, when I met her, she was associated with the Seventh-day Baptist movement, whatever that is. And I was, at that time, connected with the Orthodox Church, and I was teaching a Sunday school class. So she read my name on the mailbox, and she said, "Prophet." She said, "I have been told to go to a prophet, and that he would help me, and you are the prophet." So she came to my Sunday school class and brought all of her children, the whole motley crew of them, and there were many of them. And they all sat there, and her husband. And he was twice as odd as she was, but he didn't talk, and she did. So that made it a little bit easier. She'd turn to him and she'd say, "Archie, you do this," and Archie did it. Because he was a little puppet, and she pulled all the strings on him, you see. So they were Seventh-day Baptists. And then they turned in to become Methodists. And in a short space of 2 years, while I knew the woman, I know that she went through at least 2, if not 3 or 4 religions in 2 years. And one of the last religions I knew she was connected with at that time was the Salvation Army. She joined that and became an active member of the Salvation Army. In the meantime, she corresponded with me for several years and passed through a number of religions. At the present time, you will find this interesting, she is now a Mormon. Now, this woman is an enthusiast, and as soon as she gets imbued with a certain religious idea, she goes out and tries to convert the entire world to that particular religion. She's definitely a seeker. I will classify her as a seeker. But she has not mastered the secret of life at all. I think I would change too if I had a reason for doing it. I do not believe in anyone sitting back and letting the whole universe and life with all of its opportunities move by simply because their mother or father were a Republican or a Democrat or a Hottentot. And they're going to be one too because their mother was, or because they started out that way. I think that all of us must recognize and be willing to recognize that the Ascended Masters have a great deal to teach us, but we must utilize the teaching that has already been given to us. I have looked in some of the releases that came through some of the different people that brought forth the truth, and as long as I'm in this place, I'll say that I have noted recently some of the dictations that beloved Godfrey brought forth. And I find that they are most timely and wonderful and filled with illumination and blessing for mankind. And this is the way with all of this holy truth. Most of it, I note, however, is of a very practical nature. However, I read one particular thing which had to do with the men who were a little bit obese passing their hand over their stomach in order to reduce, and I was not very successful in accomplishing it myself. Of course, some of the people might be able to do it more successfully than I don't know. The trouble is that wherever I go, they kill me with kindness. I mean, in this activity. And in other activities, they just simply try to kill me. But this type of kindness that comes to you from the wonderful food that is prepared wherever you go is almost too much to resist at times. And so I find that I myself shall have to master the finite way and perhaps go on Gladys's radish and rice diet or something, because I have just found out that I'm 20 pounds overweight. However, this is a finite problem, and we've got to recognize that the infinite has no problems except finite problems. Do you understand this now? Is this clear? In other words, the absolute God, the mighty I Am Presence, has no problems. There are no problems in God. This is perfection. And we are supposed to be perfection personified. And our finite self is supposed to be the infinite self. Somebody say something. Maybe it was one of the elementals out there by the door. Anyway, if we cannot make this I Am law of life practical for ourselves, it would not be the type of organization that it is. The law of life that we receive from the Ascended Masters keeps us happy because it shows us how to master our human creation. Now, I know very well, and there's no one going to fool me on this, thank God, and mighty I am present, see that this is done, because I don't want to say this in the human. But they say, don't let the human fool you. But there are many, many religions today that are actually put together and constructed just as a carpenter builds a house or anything else. They are put together, and some of them are actually fabric from the whole cloth of lies. There's no truth in some of them. Now, they use truth. They use planks of truth. I don't mean that. But they put them together in order to form an organization so that they can actually earn a living in the business of religion. And this is a desecration. This is the reason why the thing is not working is because that's how it started out. That's its foundation. The founder did not get an actual charge from God. The founder did not humble himself and go to God and ask the great source to illuminate him. He didn't ask to be an assistance to the world. He wanted to be an assistance to himself, to his own pocketbook. He wanted to copy some of the great orators of the past, or some of the great and successful evangelists, or some man who was very popular and made a name for himself. Well, we're not interested in that, and God knows it, and I believe you do too. What we are interested in is the practical freedom and the aspects of freedom that will make it possible for us in this day and age to use the I Am law of life and free the earth with it. Now, this is practical because as long as the earth is in chains, St. Germain told us this, as long as the earth is in chains, you see, the masters are not satisfied that the earth is emitting its light. How can it be right if mankind are suffering in their own finite way? It's one thing to say, oh well, everything's going to work out all right. One of our staff members was talking this afternoon with a lady who claims she has divine revelations from God. And she's absolutely inflexible and infallible. She says that everything that she has revealed to her from God is true, and it cannot possibly be wrong. It's infallible. Well, I love these infallible people. They're wonderful people. You can never make them see anything unless they see it first. And that's the truth. But this woman said something to him to the effect that everything was predestined to be a certain way, and that's the way it would turn out anyway. Now, this concept is a pretty old concept. It was a concept that brought about an apostasy in the early church, in the early Christian church. The idea that, well, as long as God's will is infallible and God's will is everywhere, therefore, we don't have to do anything at all because God's will is going to make everything turn out all right in the end anyway. So we'll just sit back and let God's will take over, and it'll all be perfect sooner or later. But they don't tell you how much later. Now, we know from Master Morya that when he enlarged on Gautama's thought form of the golden anvil, that he expressed to us the need for mankind to put their talents together in loving cooperation for the freedom of the earth. Now, I ask you, dear people, this afternoon, if this does not seem a most reasonable concept to you, not only reasonable from a human standpoint, but from a divine standpoint, that when people work together and love together and serve together and call to the masters and invoke the spiritual energy, if this doesn't seem like a right thing to do, then to just sit back and wait to see if God isn't going to make it all happen. Don't you people feel that it's necessary for us to do this work, to give the Master's energy? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I won't be like the man who said, well, I knew it all anyway, because some of you have poker faces, and some of you have faces that I can read like a book, you know. And I always pray every time I come to one of these classes, and I say, Lord, give me more faces that I can read like a book. Because, you see, you get just a little bit uncomfortable sometimes if you wonder if you're getting anywhere, if you're getting the idea across, or what's happening. But be that as it may, the most important thing for us to remember, all of us, is that though the infinite be all around us, we ourselves are not yet the infinite except in the God flame within our heart. You see, in a sense, the sun of this solar system is the infinite of the solar system. And the finite is the planets that came forth from the sun, you see. That's the finite. It's the created release. The greater always contains the lesser. And our divine presence contains the essence of all that we are down here and sent it forth through our life stream. We molded it then in many ways, and sometimes it was molded for us by other people's thoughts and feelings. And this gets us to the point of influences. I feel a very important fact ought to be communicated before I bring this address to a close. And that has to do with this morning's release by the God Meru. I think this is an important thing that will help the world to find its freedom. Now, I like the idea that every person in this room and every person on earth is important to the divine plan. I don't like to think that 2 or 3 life streams are the only ones that are important and the rest of the people are all so much dust and ashes. Because this, to me, and to my way of thinking, is a reflection on God. And I can't stand to have people reflect on God with such a concept. Because God is not one who sits up here and plays favoritism. He doesn't say, I'll make one man perfect, and I will endow him with everything good, and he will be the perfect example to the world, and if they don't follow that man, why then they're all going to you know where. I don't want to say it. But anyway, God in His infinite love created a pattern for everybody that is exactly the same, except that there is an intricacy of individuality about that pattern. But the basic side of it is the same. So don't think you're too different from anybody else or you're unique. This is one of the greatest troubles of our age, is that people think they're unique. Either they're the worst sinner or they're the greatest saint that ever lived. I tell you, they are neither. The bulk of the people in this world today are reasonably good. And if they had the violet flame and the tube of light and could insulate themselves to a greater degree from the mass thoughts and feelings of the world, I tell you, they would really be wonderful people, because I know that people coming into this activity have been raised from the finite to a more infinite way of living. And this is always in part. St. Paul said, "For now we know in part, but then shall we know even as we are known," when we can see the whole concept. But in the meantime, in the absence of the complete revelation of the infinite way, why not master what we find? Speaking of the Mormons, when the Mormons came into Utah, and I'm not a Mormon and probably never will be one, when the Mormons came into Utah, they had a magnificent eye picture of opportunity, and they made the most of it in the desert, and they colonized the desert in such a way as to draw its mineral wealth and every other wealth that they could get out of the desert. And today, they have made Utah a remarkable place from a material sense. As far as the spiritual is concerned, that's not my province in this lecture to discuss that side of it. But they certainly have done a wonderful job of making a beautiful place in the land of opportunity, which a lot of people enjoy. This shows recognition of taking your world where you find it and mastering it. Now, take God Meru's address. Most of you are aware of the fact, and this is something that I can't explain to you, but I can tell you that it exists. You know that evil, according to the Christian scientists, doesn't exist. And there's a lot of others that say it doesn't exist. The story is told, of course, which I don't recall whether I ever told it to you here or not before. It's an old story. If you've heard it before, please laugh anyway. Of the Jew and the Catholic priest and the Christian scientist who died and went to the hot place. And while they were down there, they all looked in amazement at one another. And the Catholic priest turned to the Jew and he said, "Rabbi," he said, "I'm really surprised to find you down here. Why are you down here?" So he said, "Well, I'll tell you, Father." He said, "You know, we Jews are not supposed to eat pork." And he said, most of the time, even before I went into the synagogue, I would sneak around the corner and I'd get myself a pork sandwich. And that's why I'm here. So then he said, "But I've told you, now you tell me, Father. I thought you Catholics were all going to heaven." He said, "Well, Rabbi," he said, "I'm sorry to confess, but it was a weakness of the appetite that put me here. For," he said, "we are not supposed to eat meat on Friday." And he said, "There was a little hamburger stand right near the church, and I used to go over there and get a hamburger every Friday morning before Mass. And that's why I'm down here." So he said, that's it. So he turned to both of them at that time. They noticed that the Christian Zionist wasn't saying anything at all. So they turned over to him, they looked at him, and they said, "Well, why are you here?" The Christian Zionist put his hands in his pocket, and he straightened his shoulders right up, and he looked very huffy at him, and he said, "I'm not here." Well, I want to tell you people that evil does exist, but it doesn't exist in God. Now, this is the whole thing that you've got to get through your consciousness. That evil exists in the finite. It's in the little line that's a part of the infinite circle. It isn't really a part of the circle at all, really. It's the part that's disconnected, as it were. It's in the finite way. But it doesn't exist in the infinite way. But evil does exist for what it is. And if the world wants to be an ostrich with their head in the sand and think that it doesn't exist and say, "Well, I don't believe that," or "I think everything is good," they can say that if they want to. It isn't going to change or correct a thing in their worlds. We know we need the violet flame. We need to call on the law of forgiveness. We need to improve our world. Now, the fact that I'm presenting, you have to understand just how to break this up and divide it. Evil does not exist in God. It exists down here in human consciousness. And it exists in the psychic realm. Now, what is a psychic realm? Psychic realm, we refer to a person as having a psyche. And this is a soul. Now, there's a difference between a soul and a spirit. God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life. The spirit that he breathed in is the spirit of man, but the soul of man is that which came into manifestation. And he became a living soul, you see. Now, a soul begins to have consciousness, as the baby does. And then the soul has experiences. And it is the experiences of the soul that make up the differences in people. And that is why we are all different. Some of us were on Atlantis. Some of us were on Lemuria. Some of us came from other systems of worlds, entirely apart from this one. This is true, without any question. And the world is filled with a series of different evolutions. Now, people can say this doesn't exist if they want to. This does exist. And it is the psyche, or the soul of man, that is dangerous because of the dangerous experiences that it had. Now, for example, long ago, before the great karmic board had passed a law which controlled the genes and the chromosomes within the male sperm as well as the female counterpart, from which through a generic process, a child is born, certain experiments were practiced in the laboratories of Atlantis and elsewhere, which actually caused animals, after the black magicians formed the animals, and this rather kind of counteracts the story of Noah's Ark, doesn't it? Well, when we understand the whole law complete, we'll understand just how this works. I don't intend to expound the whole law. A lot of you have been students a long time. Probably some of you know a great deal more about it than I do. But what I know and what has been given to me by God, I will give to you. Such as I have, I can give, and I can give only that which I can. But I want to tell you about this important law now. Decided that they would create a subhuman race of people. And that this subhuman race would be slaves to mankind to do their bidding. They were not satisfied, and this is the reasoning that the black magicians used. They reasoned that animal life with its intelligence, which was not then as greatly developed as it is today, was not intelligent enough to serve the needs of man the way they wanted it done. So they felt that if they took human beings and crossed them with the animals, that they could produce a creature that would not have a soul from the divine standpoint, but would be sort of like an elemental. And that this creature would then be a slave to them. This was their purpose. This is a known fact by many of you. Some of you know this. Some of you it may come as a surprise. Some of the creatures, dear hearts, that were created then were absolutely the most monstrous things that you have ever seen. I have seen some of these creatures. Some of them were part bull and part human. Some of these creatures looked like a woman, the upper half of the body, long, beautiful hair, and the bottom part was like a cow. And they ran on the earth. And this is true. And when the lords of karma saw what mankind had done, and what the black magicians had done, this brought on the flood of Noah, the Noachian deluge, because they had to destroy the earth, as it were, by water in order to do away with these monstrous creatures. Otherwise, the earth would have continued to have been populated by these creatures. And that is when the flood went forth. Now, this is not taught to you in the Christian church. They don't even know this. They don't understand it. And they would probably laugh at it. But it is true, and it is preserved in some of the woodcuts and ancient books that have pictures of this very action that I'm talking about. Now then comes the karmic board. The karmic board, after the flood, said, never again must this happen. Let us determine to establish the rainbow rays over mankind. Now, the rainbow rays is spelled two ways, R-A-Y-S and R-A-I-S-E. Because this arch of triumph, which is the rainbow, with the seven primal colors of the seven rays, dividing mankind into their propensities, and then taking them through the cycles of the whole rainbow rays in various embodiments, would give them the well-rounded complement of light that would enable them to master their world to a greater measure. But when they established the rainbow rays, the karmic board issued a fiat that went like this: and henceforward forever, every seed shall bear after his kind. And this fiat stopped the action of breeding human beings with animal life. And today it is impossible. They cannot do it. Now, this was the finite way. And as has been said, with God nothing is impossible. But as God has said, let us go down now and examine the creation which we have made. For it seems that every imagination of man's heart is to do evil continually. Therefore, let us divide mankind, and separate them into the four corners of the earth, for we behold that they all utter one speech. And so with the Tower of Babel episode, the angelic beings came down and confused the minds of men so that their ears would hear a different speech. And it was done in a very similar pattern to the rainbow rays. It divided up the vibratory action of speech by touching the speech center and the hearing center in the brain. And this caused mankind to divide, and those that could understand one another went into one part of the country or the world, and those that could not understand another, they separated, you see. This was done. This shows the intervention of heaven through an established hierarchy, mind you, of very wise and intelligent beings, ascended beings, masters of light, who, although they have all of God's perfection, are not permitted by cosmic law to come down here and change the world, only in special cases. And that's when things get so out of hand that it would mean utter destruction of the planet. You've heard people say, if there's a God in heaven, why does he permit this thing to exist? Well, now you have the answer right here, very plain before you. It's because we have free will, and it's because they are not permitted to interfere until such a time as someone down here calls for interference, asks for it. That's why calls are important. Now, I cited these examples to you for a reason, because these frightful monstrosities, which were abolished from the earth by the Noachian flood, exist now only in the Akashic records. And they have been subdued there so that they are very faint hieroglyphs. I mean, they are not as bold and pronounced. They're like a faded parchment, because even the Karmic Board does not particularly desire to see their preservation, but they are kept there for certain reasons to fulfill a certain cycle of the law, and ultimately they will be dissolved when the records of the planet are cleared. This is a part of the infinite way. So the infinite way is so far above man's way. He says, thy laws are above us, farther than the heaven is above the earth. And this is true. And yet, how near the Lord is to our heart down here, you see. Because that sun presence in the center of our being connects us with the great central sun. And we cannot be separate. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Now, getting back now to Meru, I want to bring this in too, because I was trying to present to you how the psychic activity retains some of the evil actions of the black magicians. And even though the black magicians were taken from the planet in a certain action many years ago, the tools of the black magicians remain to the present day, and these tools mature just like a child grows up. And some of them get to be pretty adept at handling energy and channeling it in such a way that they can do destructive things to mankind. In fact, they're just about as good as some of their forefathers were today. And the law permits this. When they abolished the black magicians, they didn't say that there never could be any more, because that would have stopped man's free will. If you don't believe it, you go over to New York and you check with a certain book company, I can give you the address over there, that sells books on black magic. And boy, they're selling a lot of them every year. Oodles of them. There's people all over this country that are sitting down and studying the grimoires of how to perform these nefarious activities that are not of the light. Well, if they knew what they were doing to themselves, just like a lot of the mediums that are practicing the type of thing called trumpet seances, this is a very dangerous practice, because the trumpet that they use in those seances floats in the air. And you know very well that a trumpet can't float in the air unless there's energy that makes it float in the air. And where do they get the energy to make it float? Who knows in here where the energy comes from? Where? From the sitters. That's right. They draws the energy right off from the people that are in the circle. And I have seen people in a few short years Some mediums would gradually age so rapidly it would amaze you and then go downhill completely and perish, just through the release of too much energy. Now, when a man dies, the divine plan is not to keep that man earthbound so he can commune with his living relatives. The plan of God is to permit that soul to go right on up to the octaves of light and schools of light. And if you love your relatives the way you'd love your son or your daughter, you will want to see that relative go to school away from home and not keep them right around you all the rest of their life, tied to your apron strings. And that's exactly what these people are doing, are visiting seances and trying to contact their relatives. Sure, they love them. We all love our relatives. I love my mother. But I turned my mother loose. And I told her, I said, don't ever make any attempt to contact me after you leave this sphere. But go to God. Go to your presence. And learn what you have to learn so that when you come again, you will master your world. This is love. This is love that love that will not let me go. The human love will never let you go. And why does it want to hold you in chains? Human love wants to hold you in chains to satisfy its own ego. A mother that really loves her daughter will let her marry the man of her choice, even if she doesn't approve. She may advise her if she thinks it's wrong, but she certainly will let her go if she knows that she's got her mind made up. After all, she picked her choice, we hope, except in India where they sometimes marry them off at the age of 1 or 2 years to a man about 15 or 20 years older. Then they raise their wife. Because that doesn't work out too well.
Raise their own.
Raise their wife. If I'm going on too long here, I'll bring this to a close. Everybody comfortable, or do you mind the heat too bad? Well, I really want to do the right thing by the public. I don't want to go into this business and then keep you chained to your chairs. Anytime you want to get outside, I'll let you go. Now, what I want to do is bring in this aspect here of the psychic. I want to show you that the psychic action is bad for mankind because it's unreliable. I could tell you some stories of men and women who spent almost an entire embodiment in China, during which time they were constantly under the influence of opium. And when they died, their frame was reduced to a point of where some of them weighed as little as 40 and 50 pounds, although they were adults. That's how emaciated they were. Because most of their substance, you see, had been drawn off into their astral journeys. Because while they were under the influence of opium, they were journeying all around, communing with all of their departed relatives and visiting different places on the earth and having a grand time, not even respecting their physical body at all that God gave them as a holy temple, but desecrating that temple and destroying it and entering into the viciousness of the psychic world. Now then, when they died with a form of ancestor worship that was practiced in China, they then tried to commune with their relatives, and they did, and they remained earthbound. Now, the strange part of this story is that some of these beings are quite intelligent. Strange as it may seem, I don't know where they find the time to acquire it. Maybe it rubs off from some of the other spirits that are up there, I don't know. They become intelligent, so they come around, and they will masquerade. They'll draw pictures out of the consciousness of people of maybe a dead child, we'll say. And then they'll come to a medium and they'll masquerade these entities as though they were your child that's departed, or your husband, or your grandfather, or somebody. There's no truth in it. Many times it isn't the real one at all. But they'll pump your own being. They'll read your own mind, your record, because they can see much better from that side than you can see. And then they'll masquerade. And you sit there and listen to that and lose your energy and your soul with it. Well, I tell you, that's a terrible action. Now, that's why Saint Germain, who knows a great deal more than I've ever told you about this whole action, the negation involved in it, doesn't want the students of light to get mixed with this. Now, here's something else that is not commonly known. Every time these mediums practice, and some of these mediums are absolutely wonderful people in their own heart. They're not all black people by any means. This is another thing. you might get the idea, when you consider the evil side of this, that these people are terrible people. Many of them are good Christian people. They live a good life. They're kind. Sometimes they're more kind than some of the students that have light. They're actually sometimes nicer. They can afford to be, you see. But what happens that they don't know about is this, that when they pierce up into the psychic, it's as though they took a sharp sword or a blunted instrument of some kind and broke the skin of this psychic beast. And then the lifeblood or the energy oozes out of that rupture, you see, and floods down into the world, where other individuals become the victims of that energy. It spreads as a poison over the body of the world. People contact that psychic substance, and it is a substance of entities. Some of this ties all the way back to Atlantis and Lemuria. Some of these old actions are so vicious that if you could see them, you would really run. And I'll tell you something. When people have delirium tremens, you know what delirium tremens are? Alcoholic psychosis. And they see an ant that looks maybe as big as this room coming after them. Well, a lot of these are entities and formations that go way back into the old ages, you see. And these are not phantoms at all. It isn't a psychosis, it's real. And no wonder they run. The only thing is the alcohol causes them to enter through an induced state into a strata of consciousness where their vision is opened into that octave, you see. And the same thing can be done with this drug, peyote, which is a new substance that they're using. Oh, they tell of all the wonderful visions they have of the Aztec Empire and all the things that take place in South America. And I'm going to tell you something, that Master Moria, in one of his pearls, brought out something along this line, and he stopped one of our students who's rather new down in North Carolina from actually taking it through the pearl. She come to the class, and she said to me, I was at the point of taking this peyote. It seems a group of members of her Christian church, the Christian church in her town, the ladies, were having experiences with this drug, and they all wanted to do it privately and then report to one another because they thought it was so wonderful. Can you imagine the destructive influences that were being released on these people, you see? And she said, I can never thank you enough for the pearl of wisdom that came to me, that alerted me to it at that precise moment. She said, I have been taking the pearls now for so many years, and she said, I have always noticed that it gives me just what I need when I need it. Well, I'm glad it helped her. Now, to draw this thing into a conclusion here, this psychic substance is a dangerous thing for mankind to have. And every time there's a rupture of the psychic veil, it has poisoned the atmosphere of the planet just that much more. This is behind sudden rapine, sudden killing, unpremeditated murder, a tremendous amount of confusion of mind coming to people all at once, mass psychology and mob riots and things like that, hypnotism and all types of delusions. It's all based on this same thing, you see, release of psychic substance. The world doesn't know how to handle it. They don't have a tube of light. They don't have the violet flame. When this surge of feeling comes into their being, they think it's themselves. And it's their worst self. It's the mass self of mankind. This is a sinister force in action. Now then, what God Meru did today was to take the virtue of the Christian church, and there's a tremendous amount of virtue in the Christian church, the virtue of the Buddhist movement, and there's a wealth of virtue in Buddhism. And certainly, even those Muslims throughout the world, there's no question that they live according to the Koran. They have externalized some virtue. All of the religions of the world have virtue. So what God Meru did today was to work through the Queen of Light, to open the great temple, the third temple in South America, and release this energy to stream forth from the old golden ages of the past in South America, so that the Queen of Light could release it and Saint Germain could use it in order to help free the earth. But then as a protective force, the Masters anchored the talisman of light in the statue of the Christ of the Andes. And they made that a central focus in South America then for the release of the golden illumination flame in a spinning action. And the golden illumination flame substance was released, and this is an infinite flame now, by the way. It's an infinite flame. It cannot be consumed. And that released its substance, and the angelic hosts and Davids and builders of form took it up and created a golden chain mail. And they placed this golden chain mail all over the planet like a tent. And they anchored it and tied it down to the spires of the churches and the temples of the world, just as tent poles hold up a tent. And this created a bulwark between the psychic level and the human in order to stop the ravages of this infiltrating psychic substance into the world. But we as students of light have a responsibility, and that is to sustain this by feeding this coat of golden mail as an armor of holy illumination substance, so that this will permanently be sustained. At the present time, it is a matrix, and it has strength, but it's almost like a flower right now. You know, like a rose or some kind of flower. It's very fragile and delicate. But the more we strengthen that coat of chain mail, the stronger it will become until there will be no chinks in its armor at all through which psychic substance can penetrate. This will mean that the mediums who contact the psychic will not be able to get through. All they can do is contact the etheric memory of their own self and get previous experiences they've had before from it, and they'll have to fabricate and construct, you see. But they will not be able to actually tie into that awful element of negation. That means that the golden age can be brought that much more into manifestation because we won't have to be constantly handling so much psychic energy. You see what that's going to mean to the world. We can spend more of our time in commanding and taking our dominion over the earth. And this is the thing I want to point out in closing this talk. That the Lord God gave to us as men, or manifestations of Himself, dominion over the entire earth. And there are two kinds of dominion. There's the finite dominion, which seeks to use its own ego to take and carve out a certain portion and say, this is mine. And there's another type of dominion that subjugates the earth for the Lord, that plants the divine standard on the earth and says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And in this recognition, there is recognition of the divine presence, the God presence, as being the authority for the earth. And there is a very distinct difference. When you do the latter that I mentioned, then you all work in harmony, and all mankind work in harmony. And we have a golden age civilization. One for all and all for one, certainly, but not in name only, but all the way through. When we work on the human ego, then we're all seeking to find the highest offices. We're all trying to get them a little more money, a little bigger house. Not in a sense of drawing forth this thing from God, but in the sense of competing with our neighbor. This is the vast difference. There is no competition in God. There is no tying up of energy in the ego. It is all invested in the God presence, and the presence, first thing you know, comes down from the infinite way, and the finite way is tied into the infinite circle in such a manner that the microcosm is completely interchanged with the macrocosm. And so man goes on from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord, which I am. Finale. I will close with this poem. The student cried, when he had finished, now applaud, as Roman actors used to say at the conclusion of a play, and rose and spread his hands abroad and smiling bowed from side to side as one who bears the palm away. And generous was the applause and loud, but less for him than for the sun, that even as the tale was done, burst from its canopy of cloud, and lit the landscape with the blaze of afternoon on autumn days, and filled the room with light, and made the fire of logs a painted shade. A sudden wind from out the west blew all its trumpets loud and shrill. The windows rattled with the blast. The oak trees shouted as it passed, and straight as if by fear possessed, the cloud encampment on the hill broke up, and fluttering flag and tent vanished into the firmament, and down the valley fled amain the rear of the retreating rain. Only far up in the blue sky a mass of clouds like drifted snow, suffused with a faint alpine glow, was heaped together, vast and high, on which a shattered rainbow hung, not rising like the ruined arch of some aerial aqueduct, but like a roseate garland plucked from an Olympian god and flung aside in his triumphal march. Like prisoners from their dungeon gloom, like birds escaping from a snare, like schoolboys at the hour of play, all left at once the pent-up room and rushed into the open air, and no more tales were told that day. You are dismissed, children.